Hello, everyone. This is Ramzy Baroud. I'm coming to you from the Palestine Chronicle. And with me, I have is Dr. Ghada Ageel. Dr. Ageel is a visiting professor at the University of Alberta, University of Alberta's Political Science Department in Edmonton, Canada. She is a very well-known speaker and writer and quite active with the Faculty for Palestine in Alberta. Her latest book is Apartheid in Palestine, Hard Laws and Harder Experiences. And we are going to be talking a little bit more about this book and her upcoming book on oral history as well. Welcome, Ghada.
Thank you, Ramzy. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Ghada is here not just only because she is a respected scholar and an author and all of that, but she is a relative of mine as well. We are both descendants from the village of Beit Daras. Beit Daras is a Palestinian village in southern Palestine that was destroyed by the Zionist militias in May 1948. Now, the people of Beit Daras at the time, there were, I would say, about 3,000, 3,500 roughly. Now there are tens of thousands of Badrasawis, and they are all over the world. Some of the best intellectuals, the best activists, academics, doctors, engineers, lawyers, the likes of Dr. Aqeel as well, who is kind of a shining example of a strong Badrasawi still holding on the legacy of her village and her people. So first of all, Ghada, tell us about Beit Daras, your own perception of what Beit Daras is and what it represents for you.
Well, I always say that my body here in Shatat and my heart is in Gaza, particularly in Khan Yunis refugee camp where I was born and raised, but my soul in Beit Daras, my village that is no more on the map. I have never been to Beit Daras, but I carry in my heart, immense love and connection and sense of belonging. And this is thanks to my grandmother Khadija, whose her major principle, is education and instilling on us the memory of the land and the desire for freedom. She instilled that memory and that love. And nowadays, when we are commemorating the 72 anniversary of Nakba, of course, it's a very sad day because that day it's the destruction of Palestine, destruction of Beit Daras, and the eviction of over 800,000 Palestinians, among them were my family, my parents and my grandparents. So I consider myself a third generation of Palestinian refugees. And then my children have inherited this gene of refugeehood. And it's difficult. Because when you look at it, a generation after generation carry the dream, but in real politics, nothing is happening in the ground. People are awaiting, they are living in limbo in this miserable situation, whether it's in Gaza, given the blockade, the occupation, the apartheid regime, or the West Bank, not to speak about the millions of refugees scattered all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East, countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, as well as Syria, and enduring, of course, all the hardship and the wars and uncertainty. It's sad, especially to meet at this day on the anniversary of Nakba, 13th of May.
Absolutely, but if we can just talk about the psychology of the Nakba for a second. You mentioned your grandmother. If you could kindly remind me of her name again.
Her name is Khadija.
Khadija. So you have Khadija, I have Zainab and Maryam.
Yeah.
They didn't like each other very much, but they were very good Badrasawis, and the relationship with Beit Daras was somewhat different than mine, I must admit. Because for them, Beit Daras was a real, tangible thing. It was a land to be harvested, a house to be added to, a life to be lived. And then they were kind of suddenly uprooted from there. I mean, we know, we pride ourselves, Badrasawis, of our resistance. We are known throughout Gaza, throughout Palestine, really everywhere I go. Any Palestinian, when they know that we are Badrasawis, they know, oh, you Badrasawis are very stubborn. And there is this stereotype that we have large heads. I mean, my head may look large on camera right now because I'm talking to you. Really kind of close. I need to push it back a little bit. But in reality, that was kind of a symbol. Our heads are large in the sense that we were stubborn and we were strong. And indeed, we fought the Zionists in 3 major battles. And without the help of various kinds of military support that came to the Zionists from the British, Beit Daras would have, kind of lasted for months when most of the villages around it were destroyed. And they were not fighting for any sort of, their ideas of Palestine was not as complex as what we have right now. For my grandfather, Palestine was Beit Daras and Beit Daras was Palestine. And this is why he kind of lived in this state of shock, I would say, from 48 until he died in 87. He couldn't understand what was happening. How could this be possible? How could they be allowed? How could the international community allow for this to happen? So he kind of really held on the dream, not even a dream. In his mind, it was an actual possibility of going back. While my generation kind of is seeing it more at a symbolic level. Yes, we fight for our right of return, but I haven't been to Beit Daras. We haven't touched the soil of Beit Daras, lived in the houses of Beit Daras. How do we bridge that gap between what was real and what has increasingly become symbolic, so the right of return becomes a tangible possibility?
Well, I don't know. For me, Beit Daras is much bigger and larger. Even when we speak about liberation and land, it's really dignity. It's freedom. It's as my grandmother said, it's the happiness. It's everything has a taste. Everything is fresh. I mean, that attachment to the land and to the rights, because everyone has the right to have his, to his home, to his land, to his memories. And she died in the camp while she was dreaming to be buried in Beit Daras. And, particularly during the war of 2014, when, the 51 reigning sky death. And, she was like, realizing that this is not possible to get back to home, because she was, aging. She was like 89. She died at the age of 92. And she said, my grandmother, bury me here under the mulberry tree. It's very, very sad moment for her, because all the time she kept the dream alive, and she kept charging our batteries that one day we will return. The belief that this is going to happen, because the Turks came and left, the English came and left, the Israelis came and would leave, and this is going to happen in hard lifetime. Unfortunately, this did not happen. And all the time she wanted, to ignite this spark in our hearts to our land and to our rights and to our dignity and to our happiness and, all of that. And in fact, at the beginning, as a third generation in the camp, and you live the misery, you go with heart to the United Nations queue in order to get the handful, the rations of food. And you hate that moment sometimes, because from a dignified landowner, you become a refugee, you become a problem, you become a tragedy, you become a beggar, as she puts it in many ways, shahadeen, and we are begging for that. And especially that she came from Abu Shammala Aqeel family, this is her husband family, and Ammar family, her dad, where they own hundreds of lands. They were the most prestigious family in Beit Daras. So, you know, to grow up in that environment, and that is summarized in one word, dignity, and then suddenly to lose everything and live in this limbo of return. So she wanted to keep that dream alive. And this is, I said, the memory of the land became a narrative. And that narrative become my narrative, because amid the occupation that I live, I don't see my history. And all the time when I see that part of history, it is deformed. It's not me. It is not the Palestinian resistance. It's not Beit Daras. Because as you said, for her, Palestine was the small community. All the people, the faces that she knows, and now suddenly she, you know, when she has been, you know, taken.
And Ghada, also the idea that, when my grandfather used to tell us the stories about when they were pushed out of Beit Daras after putting a very, very strong fight. They were not victims. They were not prepared to be victims at any stage of their history. But when defeat was final, imagine you are on this kind of trail of tears of sorts, that all of these people coming from hundreds of villages that are on fire, being destroyed, being ethnically cleansed, and they had to make choices. Some went north, some went south, some went east to Jordan and the West Bank, others went to the sea, took boats and went to the sea. And here you are, you have, our village was 3,129 people, right?
Yeah.
So pretty much everyone knew everyone in that village. And then suddenly here you are merging with hundreds of thousands of people, new faces, new tribes, new families, new clans, new names, a whole new reality. They had no idea. I mean, it's almost like death and rebirth in your own lifetime. It's happening, transpiring from but I have something I want to admit. And I kind of said that in the book, but I kind of don't talk about it very often. My family is not actually Baroud, right? So we come from this tiny, tiny little family. And no disrespect to the Barouds. The Barouds were kind of our protectors at the time, right? My family is called Saad. It's a tiny little family in Beit Daras. We lived in the Masriyin neighborhood, the Egyptians neighborhood, and that's because my understanding is that many of the Egyptian soldiers who joined the various Ottoman military ventures ended up settling in southern Palestine. Some of them are cheap laborers. So we lived in Al-Masriyin neighborhood, and then we became Baroud later on through marriage and through these kind of networks and relate. My grandfather was very strategic, very smart. He knew what he was doing. So our loss of land wasn't really massive. We had a small plot of land. And I think this is the kind of a key for me. My right of return is not attached to an actual material wealth or entity. It is because it is my right, and it has been so embedded in my identity as a Palestinian. And my understanding of myself and my being can only become complete when I am back there, whether I have a small plot of land or a massive plot of land. But let me pass this theory on to you, and you tell me what you think. I've been told many times, Ramzy, this is impractical. What is this right of return? People get defeated and they move on, and you guys refuse to move on. Now, and I will give you the chance to kind of address this question that we are always kind of having to deal with or confronted with. My take is this: the right of return is the only reality that we Palestinians can control. Everything else is out of our control. International law has been for the last 72 years ink on paper, right? They speak about Palestinian state, they speak about Palestinian rights, Israeli violations of this and that. Nothing is on the ground. Even concepts such as Arab solidarity, Arab brotherhood. We've seen what the Arab solidarity and brotherhood have done in Lebanon, in Syria, the most recent example in Iraq. Again, they give lip service to Palestine and they normalize with Israel. We can't control that either. There is so much that we can't control, but there's one element that we can control. Whether we are in Gaza refugee camp, whether you are in Canada or I am in Seattle, whether we are in prison, regardless of where we are, we insist on our right of return because we can control that. And the moment we let go of that, it's over. We let go of anything and everything. What do you think?
Well, rights are rights. I mean, the problem is in denial of these rights to the people, because this is denial of international law. This is denial of, a basic thing, like, especially, you're not asking for the moon. You're asked or absolute justice, return Beit Daras as it was in 1948, but you ask for the minimal right. And it's up to the people whether they want to practice that right or not. If you look all to the historic cases, and in Guatemala, in Bosnia, that has been the situation. So why the Palestinian to be excluded from having their rights and practicing their rights? And there are lots of justifications saying that there is no room, this is unreasonable, impossible, given the facts on the ground and all of that. But this is, for me, means nothing, because again, Dr. Abu Sitta has looked at all these aspects of possibility of there is a room or there is no room if Palestinians, I mean, this is a right, and for me, rights are not for negotiations. Rights are, you have to insist on that. And maybe when you started this program, you said, we are the Badrasawis are stubborn. And for me, this is sticking to principles. We're not stubborn because we want to be stubborn, but this is something you have. It's up to me whether I want, to give it up or not. It's not for the leadership. It's not for the international community. It's not for the United Nations. It's my own right as an individual and as a collective. So this is when I started at the beginning. I said, I feel that my soul in Beit Daras. And I feel the connection. And even I feel it when I talk to my children here in Canada, and they want to return to, today I published the article in Palestine Chronicle in which my daughter wanted to say, step by step, I want first to practice my right of return to Gaza. And for me, that was a shock at the beginning, because this is not my right of return. All the time that my grandmother and all these generations, myself, have been fighting for Beit Daras, but for her, what she have seen. And I don't know, for me, I haven't seen Beit Daras, but as I said, my grandmother successfully managed to instill that memory and that history. And I don't know, because you wrote you tried to rewrite the history of Palestine. I know, because the history was non-existent, the same as Palestine, because that was the myth that Palestine has no people. And maybe this is what we as Palestinians succeeded to manage, not to disappear and not to stick to our rights and to fight for that rights. And we get this path of education, which my grandmother sold her tobe, her address embroidery 5 she managed to get from Beit Daras in order to let my dad go to Egypt and to finish his university degree. So back to your question about the right of return, it is possible. It is it's one of not only the dreams, but I would say this is the magic wand. If we mention it in front of any generation, the eyes would lit, because this is the return to your homeland. And in fact, not the physical return, Ramzy. It is sometimes you feel it's return to dignity. It's a return to freedom. It's a return to where you belong. It's larger and much beyond than the physical return. And actually, it's acknowledgement and recognition that you exist and that you have a right, and you have the right to practice the right, or not to practice that right, but to say that the only group excluded from this is the Palestinian. This is, continue the denial and neglecting of the Palestinian existence, Palestinian rights. And this is what we are, living these days, when you feel, it goes from giving us 46% of what rightfully ours in 1947, and then back to 22% in 1967, and then 11% in whatever Taba or Camp David, and now it's a apartheid regime. So the best thing is to stick to our principle. Is this very difficult period of time, not only stick to the right, but also stick to the hope, because I think this gives you what everyone failed to give you, including the international community, including our leadership, this window of hope, this window for dignity, this possibility to still dream. Palestinians are, maybe the only thing that they could control in their day life, that they have a right and they have a dream. And one day this right will be implemented and this dream will be achieved.
That's beautifully said, Ghada. Thank you very much for that. This idea that Palestinians will eventually forget and move on, it never happened. Both of us are from Gaza, and we have been following, like many people around the world, the March of Return. The New York Times asked me to write an article about it, and I tried to explain to them the psychology of and the centrality of the Nakba and the right of return in the Palestinian narrative, in the Palestinian collective narrative, and they wouldn't want to hear of it. For them, they wanted me to write a piece that explains how the right of return, or the March of Return, is Hamas's way to get back at Fatah.
Yeah.
And because of this kind of reductionist ideas that everything that we do in our life is factional and political, and there is nothing genuine in our collective protest or uprising and so forth. But when you think about it, so at the end of the day, long story short, the article was never published, because I would never relent that this is really about the right of return. And it's not like we were expecting that Israel would open the border and say, okay, Palestinians, go home now. It's not. And it never was. But it was about the idea that 70 years after the Nakba, you have 3 or 4 Palestinian generations. You think it's over for us. You think that our biggest demands is allowing for some milk and flour and some fuel for our cars and a little bit more electricity per day. But essentially, it has been and remains, after all of these, after several generations, about the right of return, about the original sin of the establishment of Zionist Israel on the ruins of destroyed historic Palestine. And that will continue to be the case. And everything else that happened, all the politicking, all the games, the so-called peace process, the painful compromises and negotiation tables and all this nonsense, at the end it amounted to nil. At the end, it was still the Palestinians standing there the same way that our parents stood at the fence separating Gaza, besieged Gaza from Israel, and they are still making the exact same demand. And I think this is infuriating for Israel, because they think that over time, khalas, the whole issue is going to be sorted out and brushed under the carpet, but it hasn't. And that's why the Nakba Day is so essential and so important for us. But let me just ask you this question. Why is history important? And why is the not just the history of the Nakba, but the historian himself is essential to telling the correct version of this story? Why is it important in our case, in your opinion?
This is crucial. It's essential. For a minute, I was arguing with my grandmother because she has her own version of history, how Beit Daras stood and fought and did the impossible to rescue the land, but they couldn't. But I was angry because why I have to inherit the gene of refugeehood, why I have to go and beg for these rations, why we live in these miserable refugee camps. And she kept telling me, and of course there is reality. I am under occupation. And there are some history books that taught us during occupation that the name of Palestine is mentioned. And when it is mentioned, it's mentioned in a way that makes you humiliate you. You are the defeated. So you bringing a generation that are defeated from inside. And I think when I was arguing with my grandmother, I said, why did you flee? Why didn't you stick to the land? Why you have to carry my father and my, uncle? And she said, because I wanted to rescue my children, because the human being life is more important than the land. The land could wait to be liberated, but the human being has a chance to live in this land. And, as a teenager, during the Intifada, I was not even, ready to hear her narrative, despite, and in fact, she stood and she kept telling the story and how we fought and how we resisted. And of course, I don't have any resources to prove her history. Only what I have is the reality. So there has been a generation that has been defeated because they have never, studied or learned the history. Who's my grandmother? That she's saying, because there are books, they are not acknowledging or recognize her story. And at the end, here I am in the camp. Until Ramzy in 2003, in the second Intifada, that the Israelis have been shelling Khan Yunis refugee camp. And your sister lives there, and the Israeli settlement or colony have been advancing every week, taking one row of the camp, demolishing the homes, the second row, the third. Our row was close, so we're very near. We were the 9th line in the camp, far from the settlement, so our turn was coming. Until a night they have been shelling by the Apache, and my son, the eldest son Tariq, was 3 years, 2.5 years in 2003. I carried him, Ramzy, and I ran from Khan Yunis refugee camp seeking shelter in the UNRWA schools, in the UN schools. I repeated the same scenario that my grandmother did. At the age of 32, in 2003, I realized that a human being is more important than land. And this is what she did, my grandmother, when she left. And all these people who accuse us that we Palestinian mothers send our children to be killed, this is not true. Of course I know it, but when you work with journalists and they keep repeating the same story to the become, planted in the consciousness of the world. So now you started to look and you say, where I am in this struggle, where is my role? Grandmother, by that time, 2003, she was beginning maybe of her 80s, 70s, and the generation are leaving. So we wanted to rescue that history that I have never heard about. So I started to record the history, starting from my grandmother, but there are other women. And I thought, together with my partner, she's an Australian foreigner who also have never heard about the Palestinian history, the Palestinian story, the Palestinian narrative, all in fact coming from different perspectives. So for me, was my part of a struggle to rescue that history and defeat the defeat that they wanted to impose on us. Because once I rescue this generation, I am told I could fight and I could hand this history to the coming generation. So we thought of women, because women are the people who live the details after the war. Maybe the man would carry the rifle, go fight, defeat or win and return, but women live these details. They put the tents, they go and walk to collect the wood, to go to the international UN centers. And we said, Gaza or Palestine or Beit Daras, there are different stories, but there is one criminal and there is one crime. The victims could be from Beit Daras, from Jorah, from from Yafa. So we said we have to cover all of that. So we have to pick refugees women, indigenous Palestinian women, Christian women, because they are part and parcel of the Palestinian landscape. We have a returnee woman, a woman who lived all her life in Shatat. She has also a story, the story of the exiled and those who are not allowed to return. The villagers, the fallahin, the peasants, because this is the attachment of the land, the same as refugees. So that was the story. So I wanted to rescue that narrative, and maybe at that time.
So maybe you can tell us quickly about your upcoming book.
Yes, it is this oral history, this series is coming in 7 books. The first one going to be published this summer, the story of a Palestinian indigenous native woman called Madiha Hafid al-Batta. And, you know, every story, it catches actually the details, not only the political narrative, but also the tradition, the history, the culture, the songs in the weddings. I mean, really it gives an idea of a vibrant and healthy civil society that in fact deter and refute all these stories that Palestinians were backward, barbaric, all this, you know, narrative about those who worth and those who worthless. Because remember, even in Balfour Declaration, we have not been mentioned. Even the word Arabs has not been mentioned. The word Palestine. Even when they come to speak about rights, they only speak about civil and religious rights, not any group, not the majority, not political rights, as if we are excluded from the humanity. So you feel this over the past century, this denial and exclusion. And I felt if I don't rescue that history, especially the women, with all this richness of the details of the story, because my parents left Beit Daras when they are 5 years. So they don't remember that much about, you know, the dynamic, the life, the richness of history, the culture, the tradition. Only my grandmother. And this is, and in this day, I mean, when I remember her, and especially maybe at the war of 2014, and she was really sick and ill, and I couldn't stand that I stay here in Canada while my people are slaughtered there. So I went there and I sat with her, and she, you know, Ramzy, she took my hand, said she looked me in the eyes. And that with me was my 2 children, Tariq and Aziz, 6 years and 11 or 12 years. And she said, my granddaughter, Ghada, you know, time is passing and I have held that dream to return to Daras. You know, that dream is not coming. I might die. Maybe this is the last time I would see you. But my worries now is not as before, because I know now that Beit Daras in your heart. And I know now you are not alone in this journey, because she was looking to my children. And she was, of course, relating to that story when I was like all the time saying, why did you leave? Why didn't you fight? Then, you know, after I got the story from her, how Beit Daras fought for 3-4 times, the massacres, 200 or 260 men have been killed, almost, you know, very large percentage of the male. You know, the night she returned to Beit Daras, and maybe, sorry, I become too emotional. And you know, she went to the land or to the village for a night, and then they attacked at that night.
Mm.
And she carried my uncle, and she walked. At that time, the Zionist militia used to, you know, circle the village from the 3 parts and leave a corridor so people could flee. They wanted the land. They don't want the people. The same happened, you know, in Gaza. Always they leave this corridor. But that night they mined the road that leads to Astisdud, and that was, you know, the way that she wanted to take in order to, you know, to go to her family. And she said, you know, the bombs, the artillery, the shells, the mortars, you know, from everywhere. And she's running, and, you know, a bomb here and there. And she said, I kept crying till there was no tears. My eyes were dry. And she, you know, managed to reach Asdod with my uncle on her, you know, back, and some clothes, because her mother-in-law asked her to bring some change for the children. And the next day, she wanted to return, and she returned. And she said, if I sweep the streets of Beit Daras, I would have a mountains of bullet shells. And the bodies were everywhere. And of course, she has a story. I wish we have time that I could tell the stories of these heroes who fought with very poor weapon, with rifle that is, sometimes you have to clean the rifle in order to put the other battle. And then, so that's my history, the history of resistance.
And Ghada, it's important to mention here is that the same conversations happened between my brothers and I and my grandfather. Why did you run away? You know, and the poor man tried to explain, but it took me a while, long after he passed away, unfortunately, to understand the complexity of all of this and to compare, sadly, our current leadership with the leadership at the time. I mean, these fallahin, you know, and part of the work that we try to do in retelling the history of Palestine is trying to bring back the dignity to the Fallahin who have been kind of overwhelmed by this kind of fraudulent history that reduced them to either victims or statistics, nobodies that didn't matter. But in reality, they had this incredible, sense of political consciousness and collective awareness and readiness to fight, knowing fully the nature of the enemy and the strength of the enemy. They were not removed from the reality at the time. Antonio Gramsci once said that every person is an intellectual, even if he or she does not serve that role in public. They were intellectuals in their own way. As Fallahin, as peasants, they were intellectuals. And they had a grasp of reality around them. But the fact is, the forces that fought against them were so overwhelming that their courage was not, alone enough to withstand all of this. And they ended up being ethnically cleansed, but they carried on fighting and fighting one generation after another. And I think that story that you are so beautifully telling, which is sadly, 72 years later, the stories that we are communicating right now is not the dominant narrative of the Nakba story. Yes, it's so important to go back to the Israeli military archives and to, the British archives in Palestine and dig out some information and maps and testimonies of soldiers and we killed and we raped. Yes, it's important. But how about our version of that story? Why is it that Palestinian history has to be constantly centralized from an Israeli point of view, an Israeli narrative? How about your grandmother Khadija, my grandmother Zainab? Where do they fit into this trajectory of historical narratives? So it is so essential that we reclaim it, unconditionally reclaim our history and retell it from the beginning, not just for the others, but for ourselves as well, for our own children as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this is actually a mission that my grandmother, to large extent, succeeded, in passing this memory. And this is her legacy. This is the history, her narrative, her version, and the true version. It's not interpreted through, it's not analyzed through lenses. It's her view. And Ramzy, all the 7 ladies, when you look at the series, it is very much, speaking about the same, thing. So when you read the 7 stories, you get a bright picture of Palestine at that time, a very bright picture that makes you really stand tall. And this is what I wanted to pass for the coming generation. This is our history. This is your history, not the current history of today, not the reductions. What they wanted to reduce you. And in fact, sometimes you read and you said, this doesn't belong to me. I am not there. This is not the same in the media now. When you read the articles and the news, there is a link here mentioning and always in the negative term. So I think this is what we could, pass along, not only to the world, but to us, because it's very important to defeat that defeat inside us. And we know that we really, people who have rights, who unfortunately, because of certain circumstances, political circumstances, and the Zionist movement, how they outnumbered us, and how the maximum support from the British, from all, not only the colonial power, but also all the superpower, from even institutions that have been created in order to support these refugees. We have nobody, and despite that, despite all these conspiracies, and despite all these declaration and Balfour Declaration, despite all this maximum support in the media and in the United Nations, in actual support in the money, we still exist. We still resist, and we have not disappeared. And we know well now our rights, and we know the way. And this was, her last words for my grandmother, when she said, "You know your way. I know that you're Beit Daras in your heart, and you are not alone. So don't get discouraged. We're getting there. We're getting there as Ahl al-Ard. We're getting there as Ahl al-Haq, the right owner." And it's as I said, this is why I call it, it's return to dignity.
Absolutely.
return to freedom. And maybe this is what we have been, fighting for over the 7 decades, for
I
freedom.
want to, before I forget, I want to mention that there is a very important article here by Dr. Aqeel about the Nakba, pilgrimage to Palestine, a new form of resistance. It's very important for you to read this article. And I know that our editor, Romana, is going to be sharing the link with you immediately as when I'm mentioning it right now. It's a very, very good article, very personal article, and it should be read and shared widely. The other thing I want to mention is Dr. Aqeel's book, Apartheid in Palestine, Hard Laws and Harder Experiences. I know that many people are still bashful, many intellectuals are still bashful to actually use the term apartheid. It is apartheid. It has been apartheid for a long, long time, whether intellectual courage reached the point of accepting or embracing the term or not. But this is a take on apartheid from a Palestinian intellectual, forward by Richard Falk, and contributions by excellent contributors and writers. So check it out as well. Dr. Ghada, this has been really great. It's better than anything I expected. Just reflecting on Beit Daras as part of the larger Palestinian narrative. A salute to all the resisting Palestinians throughout the years. Very special salams to our beloved Beit Daras and our beloved Badrasawis everywhere. Thank you for holding on the torch of freedom and the right of return after all of these years. It's so essential and so important that we embrace our own version of history, tell that story to our children. We are going to see Dr. Aqeel back here, inshallah, when her new book, the first of a series of 7, comes out in the summer, inshallah, and we will be promoting it for sure on the Palestine Chronicle, and happily and proudly so. Thank you very much, Dr. Aqeel, and have a lovely day, and inshallah we'll have you back here again.
Thank you, Ramzy. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
I'm going to bring my co-editor of the Palestine Chronicle, Romana Rubio, who is going to tell us. Here is Romana. Hi there, Romana. And as you are telling us about the stories to watch for this week in the Palestine Chronicle, I'm going to be removing some of the banners here. I'm trying to.
Yes, of course. First of all, Ramzy, I want to tell you that this conversation was much needed, and Dr. Ghada's words were so moving, So what I wanted to highlight this week is, unfortunately, a rise in tensions in the West Bank. On Tuesday, during a raid in a village near Jenin in Yabad, an Israeli soldier was killed. And in the afternoon, immediately, a Palestinian youth was shot and arrested at Kalandia checkpoint. Following the incident in Yabad, dozens of Palestinians were arrested. We saw in the Palestine Chronicle these pictures and this video of a 16-year-old girl who was arrested, and the face mask, the protective face mask for COVID-19, was used to blindfold her. So extremely violent raids after that incident happened.
Yeah, this is not going to be the cover photo for the New York Times anytime soon, would it? I mean, imagine if it happened in Hong Kong. Imagine if it happened in other parts of the world. But when it happens by the Israelis against the Palestinians, it's something you see on social media and maybe the Palestine Chronicle, but nothing beyond that. It's absolutely disgraceful, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to underline this concept, because I tell you what, like when I was reporting on Tuesday on the news of the days, the news of the soldier, the Israeli soldier, so we are talking about a soldier killed in a town with a stone was immediately reported on every major mainstream media and every news agency. But the following day, on Wednesday at dawn, in a refugee camp, a 15-year-old boy was killed. Zayed was resisting the occupation because soldiers were coming and they were doing what they usually do: storm houses, steal money, arrest people.
But that did not receive much reporting in mainstream media.
Absolutely. Until noon, I couldn't find any other news that the Palestine Chronicle itself and some Palestinian news agency. The news wasn't reported at all. And then also on Wednesday afternoon, a 26-year-old Palestinian living in Israel was killed at the Sheba Medical Center near Tel Aviv. And you know how everything started? Of course, the Israeli army said that he was trying to stab security guards. But there are videos that show that he was shot while he was laying on
Right.
the
These are the kind of videos that it's part of our job that we actually have to watch them, and they are just absolutely maddening when you kind of watch these terrible, tragic things. But clearly he was lying. It's like, let's assume, although we know from eyewitnesses that he was with his mother in the parking lot. There was a discussion over why isn't he wearing a protective mask.
Exactly.
But let's just play the devil's advocate and assume from the often lying Israeli or fraudulent Israeli military and police accounts that indeed he was holding a knife. Okay. But the scene that we have seen on video, he was lying on the ground and he was surrounded by several military and policemen, and they were shooting him all at the same time. I mean, what is the security justification for that, let alone the moral and legal justification? So but your point really about how the media, how several Palestinians were killed.
Yeah.
The 26-year-old, the 15 years old.
And one this afternoon, and a 18-year-old boy was killed today too. Yeah.
Right. And yet that, if that gets any cursory mention, it will be mentioned within, say, the story of Pompeo coming to Israel with his funky-looking mask and face mask, and to convince Netanyahu maybe to slow down the annexation a bit, or whatever the actual purpose of his visit. Maybe later on, towards the end of the article, you are going to have a cursory mention to the young man who was killed. That's it. It's not going to be a headline. It's not going to be an independent news report that is being carried out by agencies and newspapers around the world. And this is what we are doing at the Palestine Chronicle to try to correct this, as we have been doing for 20 years. And we know that the Electronic Intifada and many other wonderful alternative media sources have been fighting a very arduous fight to correct the biased mainstream lens on Palestine, and to offer the news that it should be told and understood, and give dignity to the Palestinian victims who are victims of apartheid and military occupation and all of this. So if you like our broadcast, if you like our content, our articles, and what you see, please go to the Palestine Chronicle and make a donation, because we are entirely, and I mean entirely, dependent on the little donations, whether $5 or $50 that we get from our readers. So please do so and keep us alive and keep us in this fight for years to come, until the rights of the Palestinian people are restored. Thank you very much, Romana, for your information and for all the work that you and the rest of your team is doing. And again, to Professor Ghada Ageel from University of Alberta, who shared Nakba stories with us. And hopefully we'll see you again next Wednesday. Thank you.